Thank you all for coming here this evening and joining us at another forum of the Institute of Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. This talk, of course, is sponsored by the Asian American Association at Harvard and the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics. Our topic tonight is, does an Asian American agenda exist? And we'll have a panel discussion where each of our panelists will present a short statement, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. Our speakers for tonight are Jason Chung, who's chairman of the Chinatown and South Cove Neighborhood Council in Boston, and the chairman of the Chinatown Voting Education Organization. Cheryl Lau, general counsel to the United States House of Representatives, former treasurer of the state of Nevada. Michael Wu, Western States Director, Corporation for National Service, member of the Los Angeles City Council from 1985 to 1993, and a candidate in that city's 1993 mayoral elections. I'm Michael Jones Correa. I'm a professor here in the government department. So we'll begin with Mr. Wu, I believe.
I would answer the question in the title by saying, yes, there is an Asian American agenda, but nobody can agree on what it is. In other words, yes, there are certain common interests that Asian Americans have together, I believe. Those could be identified in a number of different ways, whether it's interest in the way that immigrants are treated, interest in certain directions in economic development policy, a concern about the quality of public schools, opportunities for upward mobility within organizations. I think there are a whole range of issues which could be identified, but I added the concern that nobody can agree on what that agenda is, in part because of the diversity among Asian Americans, which makes it very difficult for some kind of consensus to be reached about what that agenda is. I'm sure that many of the people in this room are fully aware of the difficulty of assembling coalitions, not only coalitions involving Asian Americans and other non-Asian Americans, but even among the different Asian American groups, whether we're talking about Filipino Americans, Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Indo-Americans, and the other Asian ethnic groups, or even within those particular ethnic groups. Take, for example, the Chinese community, the difficulty of getting Mandarin-speaking and Cantonese-speaking Chinese, or Chinese whose primary affiliation is with the PRC as opposed to an affiliation with Taiwan, let alone the generational differences, or the differences, the traditional differences based on whether one's family comes from southern China or northern China. All of these kinds of things add up into what to outsiders may seem to be insignificant factors, but which within the community make it very easy to pursue a kind of divide and conquer strategy, which all too often, I believe, is a successful strategy. That is, that Asian Americans are divided and therefore are easily conquered. It raises a number of fundamental questions, which I hope we'll be able to get to during the course of this discussion, such as, why is it that Asian Americans are so successful at attaining individual power and success, but are so unsuccessful at acquiring group power or exercising group power? I think that if we look at some of those kinds of questions, that will tell us something more about whether or not there is an Asian American agenda, and if there were an Asian American agenda, how successful, what do Asian Americans need to do to be successful at achieving that agenda?
Thank you.
This way my knees will not knock as much. If we try to cast the Asian Americans into Shakespeare's observation that all the world is a stage, we would find Asian Americans not in front of the curtain, but behind it. And by force of the first laws that were regarding Asians, and tradition also, Asian Americans have been removed from the political leadership of the country. And if we are to establish a role, we must remember that the future is a continuation of the past. And perhaps Santayana said it best: those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And as a community, Asian Americans have never been major political players in this country. And this happened for a number of reasons. First and foremost, Congress tried to limit non-European immigration. What are we talking about? We're talking about the Naturalization Act. We're talking about the Sino-American Burlingame Treaty. We're talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act. However, that wasn't only for the Chinese. The Japanese, the Koreans, and the Filipinos also were involved there. The Gentleman's Agreement between Roosevelt and Japan. Then you have the Quota Bill, and then the Philippine Act of the 1930s. And lastly, the McCarran-Ferguson Act, all seeming to limit total Asian immigration. Now, I didn't recount all of these acts just to bore you, if you will, but it was to show you the climate that there was that forced Asian Americans to pull back and to look to each other for assistance. And what are we talking about here? The Chinese formed HUIs. These are associations to assist their members. In the early days, how could someone get a loan? And thus the HUIs would help with the money and thus bring support to these people. These were very successful groups. And the Hui Guan, for instance, from the Guangdong province, that's where my ancestors come from, became driving forces in Chinatowns all along the West Coast. Japanese were also successful in having these associations. They were so successful that in Seattle, that was in 1919, 47% of the hotels were owned by Japanese. 25% of the grocery stores were owned by the Japanese. But it made no difference. And the reason why is that it probably worsened the domestic situation. And this is, for roughly 100 years, this has been a stereotypical difference. All of us who have Asian American ancestry know that there are many differences among us, as you would find among Europeans. Like, for instance, there's a difference between the Hmongs and the Koreans. There's a difference between the Basques and the English. And you can't apply a cookie cutter to each of the Asian Americans because we don't fit the same mold. Il Soo Kim observed, the Chinese, the Koreans, and the Japanese do share a value system derived from Confucianism. It's a concern for property. It's a concern for the control of emotions, the respect for age, the devotion for the family, and diligence. And that seems to be a commonality with the Protestant ethic. Now, it's my belief that Asian Americans need to stress these commonalities. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. And for Asian Americans to succeed, we must look to traditions and to draw strength from them. As an Asian American woman, to tell you, when I grew up, I had to work very hard to have what I have. But that effort was very important, and it taught me a lot. And the more I worked, the more I learned how important my heritage was. And while I was working on the piano and flute in college, I realized I was only studying Western masters. I was over at Smith College. I used to come to Harvard to look for friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, and I would go into the card catalog and look for medieval and Renaissance masters, and it would say C. Sage Hall, Smith College. But what I found was I should look to my background. And so I concentrated not on the Western masters anymore. I concentrated on the Asian. And thus, instead of the piano and the flute, it was the jung, the erhu, the pipa. Those were instruments that I worked on. Tradition is important to me, and we are the sum of our family and our experiences. Alex Haley. He felt so incomplete until he knew his background. To know where his family came from, and to know they became slaves and then they became free, and how very important that is. And each generation was a building block to him. Knowing his past liberated him. So we have to rediscover our families. But really, let me digress for one moment. I come from Nevada. Poker is very popular. And seriously, the serious players don't play usually for the money. They play for the action. They play for claiming the chips, because it's just a way to keep score. And let's digress for a moment to mainstream politics. How many Asian Americans are on the Supreme Court? How many Americans are in the cabinet? How many ambassadors do we have? We have 2. One to Nepal and one to Micronesia. Really, the score, for lack of a better word, is not very encouraging at this current time. But I think we need to look beyond that and consider what is best for us as a whole. You know, that's why the Institute for Politics and the Asian American Association is so important. It's time for Asian Americans to take the stage, not for the applause, but to assume the roles that we have earned, because we've earned them well. Challenge in the future are ours. Thanks.
Well, I'm going to be really shortly because I didn't prepare any statement. We could talk about history about Asian America, like back to China and whatever it is. I believe in Asian America right now. Everybody's in the United States is that work as a Asian American in the U.S. Doesn't mean any race like Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Cambodia. We have to educate them to go out and vote and register, and hopefully we could elect Asian candidate for the future. And I'm sure like you guys right now just learn a lot of politics going on, and hopefully you guys, young blood, come forward and just get involved with politics, with community, and helping Asian to get the right candidate for us ourselves.
Thank you. So we'll open up the discussion. I guess I'll exercise my prerogative and ask the first question. The question I would like to ask is, several of the speakers have mentioned the possibility of unity and some of the things which engender difference among Asian Americans. Is there any one aspect, any one piece of a possible agenda which you believe would apply in common across all Asian groups, which would lay the foundation for an Asian American political agenda? Is there any one thing which...
I think before we answer that one commonality for an Asian American agenda, it's to address what Michael Wu had mentioned first. We come from such diverse backgrounds, and one of the problems is that we are therefore more regional. We are not national. We've never really had a national agenda or a national political presence. And so that has to be brought forth first to make sure that we are coming from that particular area. But you're talking about a commonality. I would think subjects like immigration would be a subject area that would unite most of the Asian American groups, because we've all had that particular concern that has come up. I don't know. What do you think, Mike?
I think that identifying what that unifying issue is begs the larger question of where do Asian Americans stand? Are we a legitimate minority group, or are we somehow identified with the majority? For example, a couple of issues which are on the front burner of my mind because I come from California are immigration restrictions and affirmative action. One of which was very hot in our state last year, the other of which is getting hot and will be very hot by the 1996 election season. These two questions about immigration and affirmative action really cut to the heart of who are the Asian Americans. Are we an ethnic minority group in the same sense that Latinos or African Americans are? Or should we, or are we, identified with the white majority in terms of either economic status, educational status, it seems to me that in terms of looking for a unifying issue, it begs this question of, who are we and who are we identifying with? Are we part of this group? Are we part of them? And I think part of the problem is different factions among the Asian Americans identify to varying degrees with the white majority as opposed to the ethnic minority groups, which makes it very difficult to come up with a unifying issue. I would suggest, to pick one issue, that the issue of immigration as it relates to race, as it relates to people's attitudes towards race, should be a unifying factor. To some people, this is going to mean unifying in defense against the threat of discrimination based on race. To other people, it's going to mean unifying on the basis of being part of a united front against anti-immigrant hysteria. But then to some Asian Americans, they're going to feel really uncomfortable about taking those kinds of positions because they don't really identify as minorities, either because of their economic status or because their family's been here for 2 or 3 generations and they think they're better than the immigrants who arrived more recently. So the question you asked is something I think about a lot, but it's really hard to come up with the answer. I also have found that it is sometimes the best we can do is to come up with temporary coalitions based on issues of the moment and being satisfied with those temporary coalitions, which may disappear next month or next week or tomorrow when the issue changes. But given the highly turbulent and unpredictable political circumstances in which we sometimes have to operate, those temporary coalitions based on specific issues may be the best we can come up with.
And I think perhaps with the turbulent political aspects that you talk about, it's not only turbulent or ever-changing here in the United States. Many of the immigrants, if you will, or many of the Asian Americans still have a great interest as to what is happening in their mother countries, and there is a lot of turbulence there. And so it's interesting that we still have the ties from the other countries that we bring here, and that's another reason why it is so difficult to become unified in one subject area.
All right, we'll open questions from the floor. Yes, sir.
Good evening. Thank you for coming here. My name is Genevieve Siri, and I'm a first-generation Laotian anti-American at the Kennedy School. I'm an MPP-1 student. You've mentioned the diversity in the Asian American community, and I very much appreciate that. My question really is about how you would all suggest ways for our community to deal with the social problems that affect Asian Americans. We often, whenever we talk about Asian Americans, we always talk about the model minority myths that surround the community, such as being so good at school, being good at math and science, and being such a successful group of people that we can almost be nearly like white Americans. But I'm wondering, there are also problems that affect our community, such as the Southeast Asian community, who are suffering from plights of gang violence, domestic situations, mental problems, a number of those things that I think our community needs to talk about and address. So my question for the panel is, what do you suggest, how do you suggest our community comes to grips with these problems, and how should we try to solve them? And this question is especially relevant to me as a future public policy practitioner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, talk about domestic violence is mostly is deal with policing, and you have to work closely, like helping to police the idea how to solve the domestic violence. And for example, like when the police officer arrests domestic violent person, and you have to go forward and to be like a witness or something to help the police officers to solve this case, and the district attorney. That's what I think is our young people, our Asian people, not to be afraid to come forward and speak for it and not hiding and say it will be something will happen to you or anything. If you not come forward, the problem will not solve it. It's happened to the history of Asian people. They never come forward, do anything at all. So that's why a lot of gangs going on, and they never, solve the problem.
Genevieve, you talk about a model minority, and it's true, but we lack the influence, political influence, and we lack the representation here. And you suggest, well, how do we suggest the community work with and how to deal with the social problems? In a sense, it almost goes back to where we've come from. I spoke a bit about traditions. And I realized coming to the United States, it's almost like sometimes people are ashamed to think about their traditions. But that's where we all have come from, and it's so very important to pull back to that. How do we do that? You're a role model. All of you are role models for those that are growing up. It's almost like having support groups, having people who they can refer to. It's a simple way of being there when someone needs your help. I know it's a difficult. How do you do it? Well, it depends on which group you're in and the dynamics of the particular structure. But always remember, with a role model like all of you are living so well, actually between two worlds. I've had to do that. For instance, sometimes when I boarded planes, they'd look at me and say, "Gosh, you speak English pretty well." But I was born here. And when I ran for public office, one person said, "Are you a citizen?" "Yes, I am." That's not asked others, but it was asked me. And still, you have that tradition to fall back on. And it's a matter of being role models, having support groups. That's what worked in our particular community, and it worked well.
I would say that we have to deal with the denial in our communities. There's a certain tendency within our communities to deny that these problems exist. And so the first thing that needs to happen from those who are aware that these problems exist is to get the leadership within our various ethnic communities to stop denying that those problems are even there. This requires addressing the gap between generations, which I think is one of the most serious impediments to the advancement of Asian Americans. And I'm referring specifically to the lack of communication between the older generation who are in a position of control right now and the younger generation, people your age who are just coming up and who aren't exactly sure where they fit into the hierarchy. I think that the presence of large numbers of Asian Americans coming out of colleges and universities across this country is a very promising sign because it gives some indication of Asian Americans potentially comprising a major part of the future middle class of this country. However, it will all be wasted if the Asian Americans who graduate from Harvard or UC Berkeley or other places end up disappearing into suburbia and fail to reconnect with the communities from which their generation or the previous generation comes from. So I think it's partially a responsibility of the existing leadership to get in touch with what's going on in the community, and also partly the responsibility of the younger generation to step up and, if necessary, be obnoxious about bringing up the presence of these problems.
Thank you.
I found the title of this forum very provocative because in regard to the question that's being posed to the forum, and let me just say that locally in Massachusetts, we have a document called the Asian Pacific American Agenda. This was the result of 2 years' work among 31 organizations. So that as far as the question of the forum, I would say yes, that it is possible to have an Asian American agenda. And this is an ongoing coalition and not a temporary one. And we are trying to attempt to impact policy in the state. Now, I think that that's true that all the problems that that people have pointed out in regard to the diversity within the Asian American community, but I think to a certain extent that ethnicity is partly socially constructed, and part of our experience here is what unites us, and also I think there are common threads within our backgrounds which also unites us. Without downplaying, I think that for the coalition, I think that we both recognize the distinctness of each of our nationalities, but that there's also some commonalities, and part of the problem has been finding leadership in the community that's willing to put resources and time and taking a long-term view in terms of building commonalities. So that I just wanted to, so just as a comment, I wanted to add this to the discussion, because basically what I've heard so far are problems.
Do you have a question?
No, I don't have.
Okay, thank you. Right.
Hi, my name is Irene Shang. I'm from the Asian American Association. I guess I have a question about something that I think all three of you have touched on in your opening statements, and that is sort of this idea of diversity, which I guess we've been talking about, and particularly about the diversity in ethnicities that is included within this term, Asian American. And I noticed that sort of all of you are Chinese American, and was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that. I guess this has sort of been a problem in sort of Asian American organizing, is this issue of sort of an East Asian dominance. And I'm wondering how you deal with that. If you're a Chinese American who's attempting to address Asian American issues, what are the dynamics like? How do you address some of those difficulties?
I'll give it the first try. Your question reminds me of the experience I had in the early 1980s when I was first trying to get ready to run for the city council in Los Angeles. My family was very active in the Chinese community in Los Angeles, but there were many Asian Americans to whom I was a complete unknown. And yet I knew that while Asian American support was not enough to bring me to victory, that I would need to have that support in order to even be taken seriously as a candidate. So I spent a lot of time in the early 1980s in a very multi-ethnic city trying to figure out how to put together a coalition of support, bringing together the various Asian American ethnic groups. And what I found was it basically comes back to everybody wanting to ask the question, what have you done for me lately? And that you have to have some kind of answer for that. And so it generally requires developing some kind of track record with the various groups showing that you actually have done something for them lately. This applies not only in the case of people running for office. I think it applies to anybody. It applies to students at Harvard. It applies to anybody who is trying to somehow demonstrate to somebody who doesn't really know you that you understand them and you care about what they care about. In other words, when I was running for office, I had to find a way to do that so that I went to the Japanese American groups and made statements to them indicating that I would be a strong supporter of the reparations and redress movement for Japanese Americans who were interned in the camps, even though my family was never in a camp and I wasn't a Japanese American, or going to Filipino Americans and pointing to some involvement that I'd had working with Filipino dentists, Filipino nurses, and Filipino accountants who had problems getting licenses from the state departments who were trying to discriminate against foreign-trained professionals, or going to Korean Americans to say that I understood about the kind of tensions they faced trying to operate businesses in South Central Los Angeles, or going to other groups, basically trying to show that I understood what they were concerned about and that I had some ideas about something I could do working with them. I think that the names may be different, the groups may be different in terms of student situation, but the basic concept is the same, which is that if you want to reach out to somebody and you want their help, you're going to need to find some way to get them to see it as being in their interest to work with you, that you understand their needs, that you can fight on their behalf, that if they need you, you'll be there, and hopefully when you need them, they'll be there.
And if one expands that a little bit more, with the next election that comes about, it's the same kind of question, what have you done for me? I know that many of the political parties are going to be reaching out to the Asian Americans, and the Asian Americans have been ones that have contributed quite largely to political parties, but it's a quid pro quo type of relationship. What have you done for me? And it's almost like you can't ask for money anymore unless you can say, I am going to do certain things for you. It's the same way in this political process where now many of the parties are going to appeal to the Asian Americans, as in that example that you had mentioned, that communication example. So that's going to be, you're going to be seeing the dynamics of that in a year. Right now.
Sure. I wish that people would only ask, what have you done for me, instead of asking, what have you done for me lately? Because I found that, maybe your experience was different, but I found frequently, even if you did tell people about something you did for them, because it wasn't lately enough, they would feel as if that was then and this is now, so what are you going to do for me now? I don't care what you did for me yesterday.
Well, that's true. There's a little bit of recency there. However, I came from Nevada, and I did run a political campaign there. And it's interesting because Nevada was a state that grew from the Asians there, because they were working on the Transcontinental Railroad. The silver mining was done a whole lot by the coolies, by the Asians. And it's interesting because in part of the campaign, it was, what have we done for you? Well, we go back into history, and the Nevadans seem to like that. They liked that continuity. So perhaps in California, I think Michael is right, recency was there. But in some of the other states, they did appreciate the history. And so recency was not that much of a problem.
Well, it's even like every summer in Chinatown, I do a voter registration drive, get all the different Asian people to register and vote. And they asked me a question, why should I register to vote for? What are they going to do to me? And I have to think all this answer about history. Well, this candidate, before back to Mayor Kevin White, in Boston Chinatown, we don't have a gateway that represents Chinatown. And we asked the mayor of Boston to build a gateway, and he asked me, what your Asian community done for me lately, where's the vote? You guys vote for me. Then the next day, election is coming out, and say, sure, I have 3,000 Asian on this war going to vote for you, and we're going to guarantee to deliver that percent to you. And after the election, he won by that amount that we quoted to him. He make a phone call, build a gateway in Chinatown. So I have to use that example to educate the voting, what it's all about. And so far, 1993, I campaigned for the Mayor Menino, and he won the election again, and I promised the community that we're going to take care of Chinatown, repair the sidewalk, make sure the street clean, light up the whole Chinatown. And he did, so that's a proof to my next candidate is going to ask for me, and I'm going to deliver vote to the next candidate. So that's what my excuse to what done for me lately.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Chang, and I'm a junior at the college. I guess my question might be a little bit simplistic, but I appreciate that the panelists have all touched on the issues of diversity among ethnic lines, the idea of tradition, the generational divide, and it just seems to me, especially when you were addressing that question of social problems versus model minority, that the big issue that I haven't really heard mentioned explicitly is class. And I wonder if maybe that's even indicative of what I feel is that community denial, is that many Asian American policymakers many young and upward Asian Americans in colleges are unwilling to admit that there is a large class difference, and that is really, to me, what is dividing this community and what, in the end, will, causes our whatever sort of political strife that we're all here talking about tonight. And I was wondering if the speakers could just sort of address this.
Thank you.
I don't know that I agree with your view that I think class is definitely one factor. I don't know if it is the defining factor that makes it, that separates many Asian Americans. Clearly, there is a major difference in interest between a recent immigrant family where the mother works in a sweatshop, the father works in a restaurant, and the kid is trying to get admitted to Harvard University, versus the, say, third or fourth generation Japanese American or Chinese American, in which the only language spoken in the home is English, and where the family is deeply assimilated, and that there's a major difference between those two families, and that's definitely true. But I guess when I think about the divisions within the community, the economic, the class distinctions are not as obvious to me as some of the other distinctions that I think more readily divide the different groups. So I'm not saying it's not a factor. I'm just saying that I think on in a lot of the fights within the community, I don't find them to be economic in nature.
I'm sorry, what are the other distinctions? I'm sorry, could you elaborate further on what the distinctions that you're saying?
Sure. I mean, the other distinctions that I think are much more upfront as opposed to the class distinctions, I think tend to be, if you're saying just internal within an ethnic group, they are frequently distinctions based on generation. They're distinctions based on language or dialect. They're distinctions based on what province people come from. They're distinctions based, and this is fairly common, with what political faction a particular group is identified with. And I'm referring to political factions within the home country, the ancestral country of the group. That I find those kinds of distinctions tend much more to be on the front burner than the class issues. And I'm saying as someone who, on philosophical lines, at least in terms of my view of American politics, my view of American politics in general tends to be that class issues are much more dominant. However, in terms of talking about Asian American politics, I tend to think that class distinctions are not as big a deal as they are in terms of the broader population, which is not something I'd ever thought about before I ever stepped into this room, but I actually think that is true for some reason that I haven't really understood.
I didn't see the differences within the class structure or the economic structure as one might find in other groups. And I hearken it back to those HUIs, those associations that had formerly supported many of the early immigrants coming in. It seems that I would agree that the other factors like the generation gap and the language gap and the political factions do have a very it's a way of being so divisive, if you will. Yet class is something that is still important. It's not simplistic at all. It interweaves in a lot of the problems that we have in trying to unify the ethnic groups. But that's something also that we need to look at. But I think we first need to address that generational gap, that communication gap that we have.
I would add to that one other factor. Last spring, I taught a class at UCLA on Asian Americans in politics, and on the midterm examination, I asked students to define the term crab mentality. Do the students, I assume Harvard students are at least up to the standard of UCLA students in terms of how many of you know what the crab mentality is? What would you say it is? Crab, yeah, crab as in, how would you define the crab?
Okay, first of all, my name is Bob Fulton. I work in Bishop Brown's office in Los Angeles. protective device, but it's not perceived as such, but it is a protective device to keep the group together in the sense that there is protection in numbers, or there may be jealousy.
You get an A in my class, and I'll be sure to mention that to Bishop Brown. But that's a good answer. The image you should have in your mind is of a basket of crabs, and then one crab is somehow managing to crawl up the side of the inside of the basket and is almost getting out over the top. But then some of the other crabs down below grab the crab that's almost out of the basket to pull it back down, which is a metaphor which is not applicable in 100% of the cases, and certainly is not unique to Asian Americans. It applies to some other groups as well, but that all too often there seems to be a certain phenomenon of suspicion, paranoia, competitiveness, jealousy, which results in a certain self-defeating process within the community in which those who are either on their way out or on their way up somehow get pulled back by those who are behind, which has certain obvious self-destructive tendencies in terms of political advancement or coalition building.
Thank you. Thank you.
What common issues have you seen Asian Americans of different ethnic groups work together in? The issues that they've been able to at least assist each other in resolving, and what issues do you see in the future that Asian Americans can work together to curtail in the East Coast or in the West Coast or nationwide?
Well, I could answer this. The issue is like mostly the young blood people that get involved with the community. Right now, it's before when a student, right, majority they doesn't want to get involved with the community. And recently, I have a couple phone calls from the high school student that they want to get involved with the community, get volunteer to teaching the immigrant people to learn English, and sometimes they could learn Chinese from the immigration people. And the reason they do that, they get a credit from high school, that community volunteer. And that's why I think that's a future goal that we should looking for it, get more young people involved with the community.
I think if we're talking about uniting or things that have been done in the past to unite a lot of people, there was this push to cleanse the reputation of Tokyo Rose. Remember that? It was a group that wanted to take away that ethnic stereotype, and were very successful in trying to bring a lot of interest with that. How about the downing of the Korean Airlines? This 007, if you will. That was something where the Asians united on that. Another one was the Ninoy Aquino murder. There was a unification there, and also with the Japanese being interned to have a movement to compensate them. You know, these are issues where many of the groups came together. For the Japanese internment, it wasn't only the Japanese, it was the other Asian groups that wanted to come together. So these are some of the commonalities of issues where people did help.
In your question, were you referring to cooperation between different Asian ethnic groups, or between Asian groups and non-Asian groups, or
no, Asian groups and different ethnic Asian groups working together to address certain obstacles in their respective communities. So if you can address that, that would be great.
I would underline some of the points Cheryl just brought up. You'll note that the examples she gave were mostly responses to crises. In other words, either for better or for worse, it sometimes requires a crisis to get people to do something different than what they would otherwise do. In other words, to get leaders within any of the Asian ethnic groups to work with someone other than who they normally would work with generally requires some kind of crisis to jolt them out of their usual patterns. The example that comes to my mind first is the example from the early 1980s relating to the beating murder of Vincent Chin, the Chinese-American man from Detroit who was beaten to death by an unemployed auto worker who thought he was Japanese, and the resulting trial, which led to some very interesting combinations that I had never seen before. For example, the response to the Vincent Chin trial led to some very interesting joint meetings of two traditional Japanese American and Chinese American groups, the CACA, Chinese American Citizens Alliance, and JACL, Japanese American Citizens League. Two groups which are quite venerable on their own, but which don't do very much together, decided that this unique case of a Chinese American man who was beaten to death because his assailants thought he was Japanese created an opportunity for Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans to work together. I sat in on some of those meetings and overheard some very interesting conversations. For example, Chinese Americans asking Japanese Americans, why don't you do something about all this anger among Americans about foreign cars? And Japanese Americans asking Chinese Americans about other kinds of questions. But that's just one example to illustrate what I think all too often requires a tragedy or some kind of emergency to get people to spend time doing something other than what they would normally do. Hopefully, over a period of time, we'll be able to develop some broader sense or some broader understanding of why it's necessary to build these coalitions before the emergency happens, before the riot tears apart South Central Los Angeles, before other kinds of tragic things happen, in order to try to prevent these kinds of tragedies.
Quickly, can you just answer the second part? Is what issues do you see as the future Asian Americans being able to work together on?
Well, the right thing is that the future to working on is, from my background, is educating to register to vote, because it's very important when you're a registered voter and you could elect a candidate, and when any kind of issue coming up, we could use that word or get that candidate represent for Asian American to solve the problem for us in the future.
Not only voting, but education. I think that is an issue that unites all of us, and I think that in the future that the groups will be working together for better educational possibilities for the Asian Americans. Mental health, but what about justice? Because we were talking about affirmative action. Did you read the Times article on blind justice? Where people are so-called rebelling against affirmative action and perhaps seeing, the cases that have gone to court and the tide being turned, that perhaps there's reverse discrimination. And if it comes to two equal people, equal in what they can give, one is a minority and one is white, then who should be picked? With the past discrimination, if they are absolutely equal, perhaps it should go to the minority. But you should never pick a minority who is not as competent, if you will, than the person who had bid. These are the kinds of cases that are coming before the courts, and there's been a change there. So this is something that we're going to be watching to see. Is this blind justice? Is this the end of the affirmative action program as we've seen it? Or is it going to be more finely honed? Because sometimes when you are an Asian and you have gotten a position, people might come up and say, how'd you get it? Did you do something different? Or it's not, you were competent enough, you were qualified enough for your position. Because of the hint of perhaps reverse discrimination, sometimes those that get positions have questions to ask, to answer, as far as if you are qualified. So that's a subject area that I think is coming up.
Thank you. You have a question?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, so please just stop me. But they've been coming up. I think that one of the first things that my reaction was that the lack of consensus. Everybody's talking about that we need to build consensus, and what issues are we going to be able to come together on? Do we even need to come together as an Asian Pacific Islander category? Because sometimes I feel as though that's kind of like it shouldn't even be. It's not possible. And that we need to start talking about how else can we, and I think that lack of consensus a lot of times becomes a lack of, or an excuse for inaction. And I think that there are other issues, like I think that, for example, I'd like to hear more from all of you about what is going on a national level with even if it's divided on, for example, issues not around Asian and Pacific Islander as a whole ethnic group in the United States, but, for example, Asian Pacific Islander Health Forum is a national organization. They just combined the New York and the Los Angeles and San Francisco Asian American law organizations. They've formed the Asian American caucus of some of the legislative leaders, and other things are going on. So I'd like to hear more about what is going on, what we can do, and do we have to have this consensus, because I think that it's an excuse for inaction. And I think that there are other opportunities that people can start having small successes at in terms of involvement, getting people more active in, community issues that don't necessarily, in multi-ethnic coalitions. I don't know, lots of questions, but...
Who's going to lead for this one? I'll start, and I'll pass the baton on to my colleagues up here. Is consensus necessary? No. It's not necessary if you have goals that can be accomplished through individual effort. Consensus is not necessary if you have goals which a group or a subgroup can accomplish on its own. Or consensus is not necessary if you have no goals. If you do have goals, and if they aren't limited, and if they do require cooperation from other people, then yes, there does have to be consensus. In other words, there has to be some effort at getting others to agree to be part of your team, or for you to be part of their team to accomplish that goal. So a lot depends on what it is that you want to accomplish. One example you gave, I think you gave that as an example of the lack of need for a consensus, was the banding together of the Asian American bar groups from New York and LA, and I forgot where else you mentioned, which actually could be defined as a reaching of consensus. That is, an ability to develop an agenda that brings those groups together. That agenda is much smaller and much more limited than, say, a national agenda of fighting against members of Congress who are now going to try to restrict legal immigration, which will have certain obvious effects on Asian Americans. So I give that as just an example of, it depends on how high you're reaching. It depends on how broadly you're reaching in terms of the goals that you set. So that depending on what you're trying to accomplish, the scale of the consensus you need is affected.
Can I ask another question? Well, I guess, but I think that some of those national organizations are have a difficult time putting certain things forward because they're afraid that half of the community is going to come against them, and it's dividing some of the national organizations based on ethnicity apart. JACL is being, torn apart by, debating some of these larger issues between. It's almost like a generational thing, and because there's so much internal infighting, that they're not really going anywhere on some of the issues where I think that they can be in smaller groups with maybe in areas not based on ethnicity solely. I guess that's. Then I think that we would see more, people involved. And I think that is my main, thing. I think what I was.
Let's give them a chance to respond. Does anyone?
If you have a goal and people in your group understand a certain goal that you're going after, say education, say immigration, it's almost like the big tent theory. Everyone can have their own personal opinions as to how to do certain do certain things within a particular situation. However, if you want that national political presence, if you want to be termed as a player, to come to the table and to be recognized and to be well regarded for what you can bring, the votes that you bring through, you have to have a consensus. But that doesn't mean that you all become cookie cutters. You still have your own specific identity, but it's understanding the goal that you're after. I think you have to have a consensus if you want to belong or be a part of the political scene. How we do that, I guess you'll have to invite us back again because that's a very good question. I'd like to think more on that, but it is something where you would need consensus if you want a national political presence.
Right. I'll take a question from that side.
Good evening. My name is Karthik Chandramauli. I'm a first-year public policy student at the Kennedy School. And as an Indian American, I find that discussing issues pertaining to Asian American agendas is especially troubling for me because of the sense of not fitting in to Asian America. And in spite of the fact that Indian Americans in this country number almost 1 million, they're the third largest Asian American subgroup, they're the fastest growing Asian American subgroup, and yet at a philosophical level, I think, apart from all the political examples that you have cited, at a philosophical level, Asian America is defined by Chinese, Japanese, Korean mainly. And then there are people at the fringe, Southeast Asians, South Asians, and other groups that don't fit into those nice, neat categories like East Asia or whatnot. And my question is, with that many people feeling excluded from this Asian American agenda, what sort of prescriptions would you make for people who kind of hold that Asian American hegemony within the community to broaden that notion of Asian America, not only within their communities, but also to the outside? So, like, when mainstream America looks at Asian America, they don't just say Japan or China or Korea. They say India, they say the Philippines, they say Thailand or whatnot. And also, do you think that this is more of an issue that the people who hold this hegemony have control over of, or is there something that people on the outside, the South and Southeast Asians and whatnot, have control over of? And if you think they have some control, what do you think are viable alternatives for them to help in this process of broadening Asian America's face?
Thank you. I think this is a very good question, which I've been asked many times in Southern California. Although I find that there, Indo-Americans are more readily becoming part of the broader coalition, especially in communities like Cerritos and Artesia and other areas where immigrants of Indian descent are numerous in the same sense that Koreans and Filipinos and Chinese are in those kinds of suburbs. The idea of hegemony by Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans is an interesting concept and in some respects very accurate, but I think it's inaccurate to assume that those who are in those leadership positions are spending a lot of mental energy trying to decide how shall we exclude Indo-Americans.
I don't think it's malicious. I just mean that it exists and they have that ability to define the group.
I don't think there's any deliberate effort to exclude Indian Americans, but rather it's a factor on the part of those who are in the leadership trying to decide, why should I care about this? Or, why should I work with these people? In some cases, I think that the answer to those kinds of questions is there are reasons to work together. For example, in those communities where there are large numbers of Indian Americans and where there are also large numbers of other Asian ethnic groups, they have been working together on education reform issues because they all have kids in the schools together. I know that during my campaigns for office, particularly when I was running for mayor, I had a lot of support from Indian Americans, even though that was not my particular ethnic background, in part because, as I did with the other Asian ethnic groups, I spent a lot of time talking to them about issues that they cared about, whether it was India's relations with Pakistan, which frankly I didn't have much control over as a city councilman from Los Angeles.
Right.
But at least I was demonstrating to them that I knew what they were thinking about and that I was able to talk to them about it. And finding other ways to work together. In the aftermath of the riots in Los Angeles, the Indian community was one of the groups I went to try to raise some money to provide immediate relief for the Korean American merchants in South Central LA who lost their businesses. And I'm very proud to say that many of the Indian American merchants and business people donated very generously in response to that problem of the Korean Americans. I think not because of any kind of intrinsic bond between Korean Americans and Indian Americans, but because the problem was obvious and there was a certain degree of empathy which I was able to draw upon by asking somebody to help somebody else.
Sometimes it seems that we again are talking about stereotypes. Let me bring you back to where I come from, Nevada. In my race for Secretary of State, I was helped a lot by the Indian Americans, and they coexisted and intermingled with the Asian Americans. They were considered a part of the Asian American community and were a very viable part. It's almost like, how active are you in the Asian American activities or events? Do you readily come to them, or do you actively participate? It's almost like you make your own flexibility. And I don't feel, and I can only speak from Nevada and now Washington, D.C., there's no agenda. There are people are looking to be inclusive, not exclusive. But I can only speak from those areas. But I think you make your own agenda. It is not set in stone as far as the boundaries are concerned.
I would agree with you insofar as those examples are concerned, but beyond an ad hoc level, the fact that there are no other South Asian American students here is indicative to me how much they really feel included in Asian America. And I think that goes beyond some of the political issues that you can isolate a campaign-to-campaign basis and issue-to-issue basis. And that's, I think, a bigger challenge for creating a broad agenda. So.
Thank you.
Point taken.
Yes. Hi, my name is Jenny Lee, and I'm a first-year student here at the undergrad at the college. And I have two questions, the first of which would be, how strongly do you rate your own Chinese language background? And the reason why I ask this is because it seems to me the people who have the ability to rise in the quote-unquote traditional, I guess, spheres of white politics, city council or state government or, federal government, tend to have, very strong English skills, which often comes at the expense of their own Chinese language background, which isn't necessarily their fault. But at the same time, it seems like those people have difficulty earning the respect of people who are, in much more traditionally Chinese political groups, because they're seen as quote-unquote too American. And to me, that seems like a very divisive issue between Asian Americans who are like second or third generation and, people who are, let's say, recent immigrants who also have a great deal of specific concerns, which aren't necessarily the same between the two groups.
I strongly rate the Asian language background as extremely important. But you're completely right. I wish I spoke Chinese. In fact, I went to Taiwan to learn Chinese because I didn't know it. When I grew up in Hilo, Hawaii, it's where I was born, we didn't have a Chinese school. And so instead of going to Chinese school in Honolulu, they had Chinese school. In Hilo, I went surfing and swimming. I didn't know my Chinese. And it's true. When you look at the voters, and especially in a population as Nevada, they're looking for a spokesperson that would be able to communicate for them. And with a small Asian population, yeah, it helped that I could communicate. But I have to say, if I could do over again, I'd be very, very strongly proud of my Chinese language skills. In fact, I think there are many politicians in the California area that are bilingual. And I think that's the way the world is going now. It's almost like if you just speak one language, you're handicapped. really. Being in Europe, people speak 4 or 5 languages. And here, most of us just speak English. The world is changing. Yes, I would strongly rate the background, but you are correct. Right now, it seems like to be a communicator, you would have to speak English well.
I agree with Cheryl to a certain extent about the practical reality of needing to speak languages other than English, although frankly I think that we're entering into this political climate in which people are probably going to be punished for speaking languages other than English. That may be a bit of an overstatement, but not much, based on the level of nativism that is going on out there. To try to answer your question more directly, I was the first member of my generation in my family born in this country. I had 2 older sisters who were born in China who grew up speaking Chinese. I'm told that when I was growing up, I spoke only Cantonese until I was about 5 years old. And when I started going to elementary school, I started to pick up English and I started to lose Chinese, to the extent that now I speak virtually no Chinese, although I can remember to say Gung Hei Fa Choi when I am speaking at a banquet. But beyond that, I don't consider myself fluent at all. Is that a drawback? Yes, in terms of the factor you mentioned, that is, those who are primarily Chinese monolingual speakers feeling as if there's something wrong with those who don't speak Chinese. But you're also identifying what I think is one of the underlying dilemmas which face Asian American politicians and specifically Chinese American politicians. That is the dilemma of who is it we really represent. In many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the Asian American politician represents a constituency or is seeking to represent a constituency which is not primarily Asian American. In my case, for example, I ran for the city council in a district in which 95% of the voters were not Asian American. And the percentage of non-Chinese American was even greater. At the same time, as a practical matter, unless I was able to put together serious support from Asian Americans generally and Chinese Americans specifically, I wouldn't be able to get to first base. So any Asian American who wants to get involved in electoral politics has to find a way to address this dilemma of developing support, and not only support but loyalty from other Asian Americans or from one's own Asian ethnic group, but at the same time not become so overly identified with that ethnic group that you become unelectable.
I'm agree with Mr. Wu about the candidate when color of yourself, and sometimes like you're a Chinese and some other Chinese voter and see the Chinese candidate running, and they probably think that they're not qualified for the job. And I understand, Mr. Wu, you got majority, most of the vote for is American voter. True. That's why we need two language. Every language you could speak, but to educate and all the voter to vote for the candidate is the history of your culture, of your language is more important too, and the English. That's what I think.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sewell Chan. I'm a first-year student at Harvard College. I guess my question is, well, Mr. Wu and I mean all the speakers tonight have spoken about cohesion, unity within Asian America, but I wanted to ask about unity with other minority groups, namely African, Latino, and Native Americans. Specifically, I noticed there are 2 issues which are very important to Asian Americans. I think there's namely affirmative action and Proposition 187, where these issues are not as easy as bilingual education or healthcare and access to healthcare. I mean, those are issues which it's easy to form a consensus on. But for example, I read somewhere that for Prop 187, there was a survey, and a slight majority of California voters who were Asian American actually supported Proposition 187. For affirmative action, similarly, leading Asian American organizations like OCA, Organization of Chinese Americans for Affirmative Action, Asian American legal groups have come out in support of these issues because, my essential question is is there a tension between the pragmatic need to form bloc coalitions with other minority groups and a responsiveness to the actual constituency, which might be saying something different?
Should we have the Republican address and the Democratic response, to the Democratic address and the Republican response? Okay. Okay.
I thought we were supposed to be apolitical. Go ahead.
Okay. This is the Institute of Politics. How can the Institute of Politics host a forum which is apolitical? I would say that one of the devilish aspects of the current Republican strategy is that it is an effective approach to the divide and conquer strategy. That is, that the emphasis on people's fears about immigration, and beyond that, the fears about people not having their fair share and trying to scapegoat somebody else for that, is a perfect way to divide a potential Democratic constituency. Take, for example, the affirmative action issue, which may be the subject, is likely to be the subject of an initiative in California in a couple of years. And it's certainly getting a lot of people hot under the collar in several different ways, even now as we lead up to 1996. The affirmative action issue, I think, is a great way to divide up Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans, and the white population. And the reason why there's no easy prescription for the role of Asian Americans as the affirmative action debate unfolds is that for Asian Americans, affirmative action is a real mess. That is, it benefits Asian Americans in certain ways, it hurts Asian Americans in other ways. It's not as clear-cut as it might be for other groups. And so, in the climate which is developing now, which includes what I would describe as leadership in the African American community going around to people they look at as their allies, saying, are you with us or against us? Nervous white Democrats who are trying to figure out how to avoid getting clobbered. The news media, which is, I think, successfully stoking up this issue a bit higher. Within this climate, Asian Americans don't exactly know what to do. If it's an Asian American, middle-aged, middle-class aerospace engineer who is desperate to get his or her daughter into UC Berkeley this fall and thinks that the daughter is not going to get in because of an unofficial quota trying to keep Asian American numbers down, that parent is probably going to be upset about affirmative action. If, on the other hand, you're talking about an Asian American who lives in Monterey Park, where 50% of the population is Asian American, but where I think only about 20 or 25% of the police department is Asian American, the application of a quota saying that the percentage of Asian Americans in the police department should be comparable to what it is in the population might actually be a popular idea. Which is affirmative action? Which is the legitimate use of affirmative action? Which is not the legitimate use of affirmative action? I think these are the kinds of complicated questions which many Asian American Democrats and Republicans are going to be struggling with over the next couple of years. And my prediction is it's going to be a muddle. There isn't going to be a clear sense of where Asian Americans are going to end up.
What do you think they should do?
What do I think Asian Americans should do?
Asian American politicians, namely.
Relating to affirmative action?
Relating to issues where there's a division among Asian Americans and it's not clear-cut. And I mean, do you see a pragmatic need, for example, in your elections did you see a pragmatic need to ally with other minority groups on such issues, even though there might not be a complete sense of unity among your constituents, among your Asian American constituents?
Well, the important instruction for any candidate is to do whatever you need to do to win the election, and to do whatever you need to do to put together the 50% plus one that you're going to need to win. And so, depending on the particular circumstance you're talking about, it may or may not call for what you're saying, depending on how a controversy unfolds. And this is probably not going to be the most inspiring advice that you will ever hear about what to do in politics, but it may be very realistic, which is that in some cases, when a messy controversy comes your way, the best thing for you to do may be duck. In other cases, the best thing for you to do when a messy controversy comes your way is throw it right back. In other cases, it may be advisable to take a suicidal position, but this is not generally advisable.
Republican, definitely not to divide and conquer. Because what we're talking about is not so much affirmative action, we're talking about the bottom line. Can California afford all the monies that are going out? You have to draw a line somewhere. It's not discrimination. It's the bottom line. It's economics. So it's not a divide and conquer type of philosophy at all. It's to do what is best for the citizens of California.
The West Coast Asian Republican must be stronger. But to what I believe is Boston is Asian people believe in a candidate and doesn't believe in Democrat or Republican or Independent. They want elected the candidate that represents the Asian community. That's what I think. Because Boston is so small amount of Asian population and a small amount of population that reaches a voter. So.
Okay. Hello. Well, to start off, I'm a student at MIT, and my friend and I felt kind of left off when earlier you mentioned Harvard and UC Berkeley and forgot us. I guess I have two things to say. To begin with, almost the entire evening we've been chasing our tails talking about divisions within the groups and how do we overcome it, and we can while we kind of could, and all that stuff. I just would like to bring back one point that was mentioned earlier that was kind of dropped, was the issue of class division and also ethnic division. Now, I'm from Taiwan, and I can tell you the environment I grew up in, it's extremely racial among the Asian groups. I mean, we don't like the Japanese because they're too rich. We don't like the Filipinos because they're too poor. We don't like the Indians because they're too dark. All right, there are all sorts of. I mean, it's true. It's true, and I think so it's not just racial. It's class division as well. And earlier, Mr. Wu mentioned how you may have a parent working in a sweatshop trying to send their kids to Harvard. Well, generally that doesn't happen. Most people at MIT, Asian Americans, at MIT or at Harvard, they're usually from middle upper class or middle class. You don't see somebody working in a sweatshop and sending their kids to Harvard. That just doesn't happen. So there's a real class division that I think was being overlooked by the panel here. Now, but amazingly, I think ever since last term when I started working with some community groups in Boston, I've discovered that despite all that, we have a tremendous amount of unity, which I found surprising. Now, back to that aside, the second point is a lot of people have been asking, so what should we do? What should we do? And I haven't heard anything concrete. So let me just lay out two specific things. One is the question of affirmative action that was just brought up. Now, should we fight for affirmative action? I'm a college student. I'm applying for scholarships. There are these minority scholarships that I cannot apply for because I'm not underrepresented. Is that right? Should we fight for it, or shouldn't we? Or maybe something bigger. Should we have more Asian Americans in the police department? Should we, or shouldn't we? Second specific thing, the question of voting. Now, earlier, Mr. Chang was saying, was implying that perhaps we should vote in blocks. Through all of our support to Mayor Menino, or maybe we should all be Democrats, like the blacks did for a while, or we should all be Republican. I mean, is that what we should do, or should we do something more like what Ms. Lau was saying? On one hand, believe in your conviction and vote in what you believe in, but and then just kind of rely on this vague sense of consensus among all Asian American groups and kind of cross your finger that they'll come up with enough consensus that will put Asian Americans into politics. Thank you.
Does that answer the question? Is that a question? Can I answer the question about first one? Well, I believe in that, like you say, the scholarship, right? You apply for it as a minority, and sometimes you didn't get the scholarship.
Well, I can't even apply.
You can't even apply. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, for example, back to 1988, the mayor of Boston, right? We only have a couple Asian police officers, and every class they put Asian police officer, like 50 in a class. It's none of Asian that get in, and that's what bring the politics into it. Asian people deliver the vote and get the political person to guarantee us what we want for the future. For example, we asked them to put an Asian qualified for speaking a language for the job for the community. And the mayor is the promise when he win election. Then the first time ever in the city of Boston, they put 7 Asian police officers in the class. That's why I believe in that. It could be happen if we get involved in politics. The scholarship might be happen. You know, we avoid loud enough for the leadership to help us.
I don't think we overlooked the class divisions. Jennifer brought that up. And it was from my background and Michael's background that that class distinction or the class division was not as prominent. But that didn't mean that it was not an important issue. So it wasn't that we had overlooked it. It was just our backgrounds that showed that it was not that much of a distinction. But I agree with you. Affirmative action, I would fight for it. Because I gave you that example. Hey, if 2 people are absolutely the same, who do you give it to? I would give it to the minority because of the past discriminations. That's been the case study. That's been the case background all along. Now, I told you that thinking is changing. And with the changing of the rulings, the Supreme Court justices, this might change too, but I would fight for it because of the past discrimination. Voting in blocks, if we want to be a political presence, yes, we should get people together, but not coerce their vote. You get people who believe in a certain issue, have them vote together.
There were a lot of interesting questions within your question, but let me try to answer 2 parts of it. First of all, the part about minority scholarships and whether or not Asian Americans like you should be able to apply. I would generally support the idea of adding economic class as a criteria for minority scholarships and not basing the criteria entirely on the color of the student's skin, but also on the basis of economic need, which I think would be more fair and also more defensible to the general public about why scholarships like that. So in other words, I don't know if it's practical in this particular case, but it seems to me that a program which is intended to provide money to those who don't have enough money should be based in part at least on criteria relating to economic class and not just on the color of the student's skin. The other thing I wanted to address is the question you raised about block voting. Or I sense that what was underlying your question there was what's wrong with individuals making individual decisions about who they think the best candidate is or the right side of the issue, as opposed to feeling compelled to be a part of a group for the group's sake. The answer to that is that given a political system in which numbers matter, in which larger numbers matter more than smaller numbers, that a group has more power when you're part of a group than when you're part of an individual, or than when you're just operating as an individual. And so that means that Asian Americans have to master something that we have not been masters at before, which is the ability or the willingness to submerge part of our individual agenda to be part of a group agenda. Now, some Asian American groups have been more effective at that than others, but in general, as I alluded to in my opening statement, I think that Asian Americans have been spectacularly successful in many respects as individuals, but have been resounding failures in many respects when it comes to wielding group power. When members of a particular ethnic group tend to not identify as a group and tend to go their own way, that is, not identifying with a particular political party, that means the good part of that is the individuals probably have a greater sense of individuality or efficacy in terms of their own vote. On the other hand, from the point of view of the candidates seeking the votes, from the point of view of the parties who are trying to decide how much money should I put in to get out the vote activities in the Asian American community as opposed to the Latino community or the African American community, in many cases the choice will be, let's put the money into the African American community or the Latino community. At least you know that if they do turn out, they're going to be with us, as opposed to the sense for the Asian Americans where all too often you never know where they're going to be. They're too independent. They go their own way. It means that in a close election, Asian Americans have the potential to be the swing vote, so they might get a lot of attention. On the other hand, Asian Americans may not attract the kind of support that is money for campaigns because neither the Democrats nor the Republicans can have a very high level of certainty that if the Asians do turn out, that they'll be on their side. And so that could result in Asian Americans being excluded from the calculations.
Thanks. We're reaching the end of our time. If we could, I believe there are two more people willing to ask questions. If both of you have short questions, and you could ask them one after another, and we'll let the panel then sort of answer both questions and wrap up the evening.
Okay, my name is Shirley Zhuang, second-year student at Kennedy School. My question is very simple. How do you solve or handle the conflicts between being accepted by the majority of the society, assuming the white group, and in the meantime keep your ethnic background, heritage, tradition? Not only yourself, but also how do you educate your people to do this transition, adjustment, assimilation, and how do you educate the majority group to accept there's other groups, they behave differently, but they have their merits?
Hi, my name is Chantal Cepeda, and I'm a first-year MPP here. I'm also from LA, and I want to say, Mike Wu, I supported you, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Unfortunately, you didn't win, but you got my support.
Don't change your registration, please.
So now to my question. A gentleman who asked a question previously referred to 187. I want to focus on 187. Being from LA, it's a disaster. So let me just set out my politics right there and then. But there was a comment that was made previously by Cheryl Lau with regard to this particular legislation not being discriminatory but being in the best interest of the state. I want to preface my comment by saying and by referring to the history that was laid out by Cheryl Lau herself. You referred to many discriminatory immigration policies that identified specific groups, whether it was the Chinese Exclusion Act or the act that prohibited Japanese women who had married U.S. citizens, mainly white men. My question is this. For those of you who are not familiar with Proposition 187, it is a policy that denies public service and education, which is currently under constitutional law permitted for all children, irregardless of their citizenship status. So it denies public services and education to undocumented immigrants. Now, the very special aspect to this law, to this policy, excuse me, it's not law yet, thank God, is that it has a suspect clause. So there's a suspicion clause to it. Teachers, health practitioners, the public services that are denied are public health, education, and then there's a criminal component. I'm not going to go into that. But on the medical and the education, discretion is given to frontline workers, teachers, doctors, people who run clinics, to report and deny services to the people they suspect of being undocumented immigrants. If you're from Los Angeles, and Mike Wu has said African American, Latino, and Asian, and that makes him a total LA person because there's everything in LA. In Los Angeles, it's very difficult to distinguish who's a citizen and who's not, simply based on a suspicion clause. And as we all know, there is a large Asian population and Asian American population in Los Angeles, intermingled with Latinos and other groups.
Can we just
so yes.
Thank
I'm
you.
just prefacing. But my question is to Cheryl Lau: how can this policy be called non-discriminatory if it has this suspicion clause that singles out not only Latinos, unfortunately the media focused too much on them, and and perhaps this was a failure of coalitions to bring in Asian Americans, the fact that it also would hurt a lot of Asian Americans and Asians in being suspected of being non-citizens. So how can you justify saying it's not discriminatory on that basis? And secondly, what was the failure in terms of not getting enough? 56% in LA County Asian Americans voted for this policy. Mike Wu, how can we work around this? What failed? So
Thank you.
To Cheryl and to Mike, thanks.
My answer is still the same, because when you bring in and you have the public service and the education for the undocumented immigrants, what it does is it just reduces the pool of monies that are available for the health and the education for the others. And so what it is just trying to have the best type of public service and educational services for those that are citizens of California. And when you bring in all these people, it's just too difficult. I mean, you only have X amount of dollars. And you have to spend that in the best way possible. And it's the same way with the contract with America, where they're trying to reduce the size of government so that you can get more for your money. It's not discrimination. It's going to what we can pay. We only have so much. So what do? Do we just reduce the services for everyone, have everyone on the same plane with a reduction of the public services and the education? Or do we protect those that live in California and have paid into the system, that they can get what they have paid in, get it back? It's just a matter of numbers.
In my opinion, Proposition 187 is an example of a brilliantly wicked strategy which divides and conquers. It does this by playing into something that's going on out there in the public mind. That is, when a voter is trying to decide how to vote on a particular issue, whether it's Proposition 187 or something else, they try to figure out, well, how does this affect me? Am I somehow part of the group that is the beneficiary or target of this measure? And it causes a lot of hard thinking, I think, which in this particular case resulted in many Asian Americans, Latinos, and African Americans voting along with the white majority strongly in favor of Prop 187. In other times, there have been times when people in the middle have tended to identify more with the people below them who are working their way up, rather than people above them who they perceived as keeping them down. But I think at the present time, and I think this is not unique to the 1990s, but it goes back to the Reagan era, the 1980s, the people in the middle are not identifying as much with people below them, but instead are identifying with people above them. And so I think the way this played out with Proposition 187 is that a unifying factor for the pro-187 vote was the whites, Latinos, Asian Americans, and African Americans decided we're better than these illegal immigrants coming in. Part of what was brilliant about this strategy is that it targeted, at least on the surface, people who are here by definition illegally, people who by definition cannot vote, people who are generally afraid to speak out for themselves. So it's brilliant to target them because they're essentially defenseless. And it's a way of dividing, of cutting a cleavage right through the middle and getting that middle-of-the-road, middle-class vote, regardless of the color of their skin, to identify with the white majority as opposed to the people who are working in sweatshops, working in the restaurant kitchens, working in various other places where legal Californians won't work. And so to address your question about, I guess the latter part of your question had to do with, what to do differently about it. It requires dealing with what I think was the underlying question, which was never really addressed during the campaign, which the underlying question in my mind is, why do these immigrants come to California in the first place? Is it so they can have their babies born in the hospital? Is it so that their kids can go to school? Is it because they can get on welfare? while undoubtedly those things happen, in my opinion, the main reason why they come, the main reason why legal as well as illegal immigrants come, is to make money, to get jobs. And unless you address that cutting off access to public services really is not going to result in a massive reversal of people going back to Mexico or El Salvador. But given the way our politics works, especially given the way that initiative campaigns work, it's very hard for those issues, those kinds of concerns to come up. And I'm concerned that the very same thing is going to happen 2 years from now in the affirmative action battle, where the underlying question is going to be, is there still discrimination today on the basis of race? All polling data shows that whites answer that question very differently than ethnic minorities, including Asian Americans, answer that question. But instead of that question being asked, is there still discrimination today based on race, and so therefore is some kind of affirmative action necessary? Instead, the proponents of dismantling affirmative action are going to try to define the issue as, do we really need this kind of reverse discrimination today? And that the fundamental question of whether or not there is still discrimination today based on race is not going to get asked.
Well, California is a lot of discriminations going on, and I'm from Massachusetts. So I'm working on this. Right now, Massachusetts is a small population of Asian America and immigration people. And in the several years, I know it will increase a lot of immigration people because a lot of people on the West Coast come on the East Coast to live. They can't deal with the West Coast anymore. So what I'm looking for is a future. We're talking about future, to educate the immigration people to get into the politics and to help us in the future. For instance, the voting in California, there's a lot of them is not registered voter. We have to provide nothing will happen in the future.
I don't want to forget Jody with her question. I think she said this is a merely simple question, but there you are, Jody. I didn't think it was a simple question, but how we can, this is a conflict that you talked about being accepted by the majority and still keep your heritage. What is the majority? It's the white population, right? But within the white population, don't they have separate heritages? Aren't they German or Polish or English or French or whatever? They have their own heritage too. They blend so well together, they look like the majority in a sense, but they also have their own heritages. How do you get past that? Be proud of what you are, because they'll see that. And those that don't see it, never mind about them, because you'll never be able to please everyone. But you stick with your convictions. They will probably respect you more for that.
How do you educate people? For your own group and also for the other group?
It depends, because some of them are educated by your being your own person, and your actions speak louder than words. Others have to be told, brought there and say, hey, this is how it is. It just depends on how you do it, but it's just being at peace with yourself, having your own convictions and doing what you feel is right. That speaks better than trying to be someone that you think another person would like. You're not true to yourself.
Right. Well, let's give our thanks to our speakers for this evening. And thank you all for coming.